At one point, she had exploded during a Kennedy family gathering. Listen to this. I ran through every one of the damn Kennedys like a machine gun. I had just had enough. I'd had it up to here. I blasted them all to their face. I let them know exactly how I feel about them. That was the only time you could hear a pin drop in a room full of Kennedys. It was something I'd wanted to do for a long time, but I hadn't had the courage, and I decided I wasn't going to be a mouse anymore. Can you guys picture that at Hyannis or perhaps Hickory Hill? The whole family is sitting around. Beautiful Joan stands up in the room, Ted probably mortified because it seems like he was always mortified by her, and her just letting them have it. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell, and this is episode 16 of our Ask Not series. We are talking about the Kennedys and the women they destroyed. And the woman we are talking about today was a Kennedy. This is episode 2 about Joan Kennedy. I'm eager to get into our reading today, but I do want to say also that our next book is all about Ted Kennedy. We are going to be going through Chappaquiddick, Power, Privilege, and Ted Kennedy Cover-Up. So we will be going through the story of Chappaquiddick, which we went through this episode and Joan's reaction to it in our last Joan episode, which was episode 8. So I will link that in the show notes. We also went through a Life magazine that showed America's reaction to Chappaquiddick, and so I will link to that as well. This episode is all about Joan Kennedy. How swinging should a first lady be? In the run-up to Ted's inevitable announcement that he was going to run for president, this was what the media focused on: Joan's looks. In the style sections and women's magazines, other women disparaged Joan's appearance and effect, taking her apart surgically in ways Ted never had to endure. They criticized her miniskirts, her knee-high boots, how she wore her hair and makeup. They pilloried her for wearing skirts without slips and gowns with side slits. Even the doctor treating Joan for her alcoholism called her assistant and asked if Marcia might persuade Joan to please tone down her makeup and wardrobe to look a little more ladylike. As if that's the place of an alcoholism doctor. No one was telling Ted to go on a diet or do something about his ruddy complexion or to quit drinking altogether, which he desperately needed to do. No, Joan and her hemlines were the problem. Nobody understood that Joan was trying to get the attention of the only man who mattered, her own husband, while also sticking it to him. Her clothes were kind of an act of rebellion. She was a gorgeous woman in her mid-30s, coming into her own alongside American feminism. Joan was born in 1936. Here she is about the time of the chapter we are reading today with 2 of her children. Really beautiful. And then here she is as she goes on the campaign trail. And this is the Joan that we're going to be talking about in this chapter. Few, aside from Kennedy wives, knew the indignities, as Joan had experienced, of slinking away from a party thrown in your own home, having watched your husband flirt with every other woman in the room, only to hear the whispers later that he had had sex in the library with one of your guests after you went to bed. Or to have lunch with a friend at the Ritz, seen by all of Boston's high society, only to learn that that friend, too, had slept with Ted, and that Joan was the last to know. That would be incredibly humiliating. There was nothing he wouldn't lie about, no corner he wouldn't cut. He was a supremely unserious man who the media kept propping up as Camelot's last hope, even as they knew better. Everyone on the Hill knew about the drugs that he kept in his desk in the Senate. They'd all heard the story about the 14-year-old girl he had tried to, and whose parents he had paid off. Maureen Callahan does not give us specifics of this. If you know more about that or have an article, please link it in the comments. This is something that was unfamiliar to me. Or the high school girl he had hired as an intern and began having sex with. She was only 17. Who could forget the time he caught 2 of their children using cocaine, and then during his subsequent anti-drug talk to them, telling them they had to be careful. Their mother suffered from addiction, and it was her bad genes that put them at risk. And then deciding to do a few lines with them after that little anti-drug talk. Or the 2 abortions at least one of his mistresses had to have. Or how about the doctor who would show up to Ted's office and treat him for gonorrhea regularly? Did Joan ever wonder if her own miscarriages had come from his sexual infections? Probably not. Joan had been an innocent and a virgin when they married. At one point, Ted even had their nanny dress up in Joan's clothes and play the hostess at a party. And Joan began to feel that these things were telling her she was utterly replaceable in every way to him, that she was unnecessary. Ted was a drunk too, but no one criticized him the way they did Joan. His pain was valorized as all a result of 3 dead brothers and now an alcoholic wife. So hey, he was entitled. That was the thinking. So it was Ted on the cover of People magazine with Teddy Jr. teaching the 12-year-old to ski 4 months after losing part of his leg to cancer. It was Ted who told the media that he had been the one to break the news to their son that he was going to need an amputation. Joan had kept it together through the worst of Teddy Jr.'s illnesses and treatments, and only then, once he was home and safe and recovering, did she let herself fall apart. A magazine pointed this out by saying, "Joan Kennedy," the headline read. It wasn't a nervous breakdown. She only needed a rest. The story inside, by well-known journalist Liz Smith, explained why Joan had just spent 3 weeks at Silver Hill in Connecticut, which Smith described as a private sanitarium. This was essentially a rehab facility for the rich and famous. Smith cited the pressures of being a Kennedy wife. She has accepted the realities of her married life, Smith wrote. The senator's frequent neglect, his eye for a pretty girl, his early to late political habits. She also noted Ted's desire that Joan not seek outside help. Senator Kennedy, Smith reported, didn't want his wife to see a psychiatrist in the first place and had to be convinced some years back that it was vital. Part of her was still deeply in love with Ted. She worried about him regularly, that he might succumb to the same fate that Jack and Bobby had. She wondered if there was an anti-Kennedy view of some unknown person at the federal level, and that as long as he stayed in his current position, he was apparently safe. But if he pursued higher office than that, namely the presidency, that then he would be the target of assassination as well. Joan, over and over again, kept saying that she hoped he would not run. Can you blame her? Her father said. In the end, he did run. Months before Ted announced in 1980, he mounted an intra-party challenge against President Jimmy Carter. Meetings were called, strategies debated. The main worry was not Chappaquiddick or Ted's alcoholism or his rampant womanizing. The real problem was how to handle Joan. I hate this so much. I realize that when you get into politics at the highest levels, you've really got to think about optics. You have to have your ducks all lined up. Everything has to look good, especially back then. This would have been for the 1980 race. But she's scared for him. And yes, she has had her alcoholism. She has had her weak moments. But she was starting to grow. She had been reinventing herself on her own terms for some time. In 1972, she had sat down with Good Housekeeping and spoken candidly of meeting a psychiatrist 3 times a week. She was one of few women who was willing to go public with such an admission. She was working hard on her sobriety, she shared, and she was still struggling with her self-worth. This is a quote from Joan. "It's very easy to feel insecure when you marry into a very famous, intelligent, exciting family. It's been very difficult. You start comparing yourself to the other Kennedy women, and somehow your confidence in yourself begins to evaporate." I think this is so resilient and bold. This is 1972, so this was 3 years after Chappaquiddick. And for her to have processed enough, just speaking honestly about her own failings and challenges is really, really something. In this report, she did dismiss reports of Ted's womanizing, and she said she believed everything he had told her about Chappaquiddick. So alongside her personal self-discovery and a beginning desire to tell the truth about things, she was still participating in the cover-up, and she was allowing herself to be gaslit about what Ted Kennedy had done and what he was doing. When that cover story hit the newsstands, Joan thought Ted would be proud and grateful that she had covered for him. She had violated the #1 rule of being a Kennedy. Do not air your problems in public. Drinking, adultery, rehabs, Kennedy family squabbles, that was all bad enough, but psychiatry? That's the thing that pushed it over the edge. Why did she have to be so public about this? Did she really want people to think she was crazy? Was she trying to torpedo his chances to be president? His coldness and criticism had sent Joan right back to drinking. And this made Ted contemptuous. He would be openly contemptuous in front of the children. But he wouldn't divorce her. It was kind of an excruciating punishment for her, being needed by her Catholic husband as a political prop, but only ever receiving his disgust. Alongside these events, the culture was beginning to wake up. In October 1974, Joan found herself, along with Betty Ford and Pat Nixon, on the cover of Time magazine. "The Ordeals of Political Wives" was the headline. And inside were multiple pieces on the demands specific to these women who were expected to be domestic goddesses, paragons of femininity, perfect mothers, tireless campaign surrogates, and stoics. Joan was covered with extreme sensitivity. I think it's really wonderful that someone is finally seeing these things and writing about it. The 60s and 70s was such an interesting period of growth as a nation and a move away from naive embracing of simple explanations and instead being willing to dig into things that are harder and more complex. And that's really admirable. In writing of her struggles, Time noted, "Ted has not been much help. With his frequent absences and his magnetic attraction for women, she is almost never alone with him. There are always 10 advisors around the house, 84 people on the boat, and sisters-in-law and kids everywhere. Ted does not deliberately ignore her, but he scarcely treats her as his equal. Though he did take her to Russia last spring and let her meet party leader Brezhnev, he wanted her to listen without asking questions." I think it's really fascinating that Time wrote this so plainly. As I read the life articles that we've gone through, and even reading this quote from Time, I'm struck by the way journalism has changed. And now, regardless of your political party, you have to look back at people like Joe Scarborough and others who covered for Biden's increasing mental deficiencies and inability to communicate. And they covered for him until it was impossible to cover for him. And then they dropped him like a hot potato. And instead, journalists used to dig and ask questions even when it was contrary to their own political wishes. I wish we could go back to that kind of integrity and intensity in journalism. Now, I will say that obviously we've already talked extensively about the way that they covered up JFK's philanderings, they covered up Ted's. So there were certain subjects where they did not report honestly or where they didn't wish to dig. But when it came to political issues or cultural issues, journalists were digging, and they would dig even to their own political disadvantage. And I think that's the honorable way for journalists to operate. Back to the book. Such intense pressures, Time concluded, understandably resulted in Joan's substance abuse and subsequent need for help. Of course she needed treatment. Of course she was seeing a psychiatrist. Of course she deserved to, quote, recover her health and develop a greater sense of her own self, end quote. There, in the august pages of the nation's foremost weekly news publication, Joan Kennedy felt she had been vindicated. She wasn't mentally ill. She wasn't crazy. Being depressed did not make her ungrateful or weak. The bicentennial 1976 was a consequential year for Joan. She found herself still grappling with alcohol and checked into a New York facility. One of her fellow patients in group therapy, y'all listen to this, had sold Joan's confessions to the National Enquirer. Among them, she had talked about Ethel Kennedy, Rose Kennedy, and the family themselves. "I'm not as bright as they are," was the quote. "And I'm so tired of being the dumb blonde of the family. I've never been able to compete. So I've always been on the perimeter, kept outside the family circle." Obviously, if you're not familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous, a primary piece of the whole thing is embedded there in the name, anonymous, that you are to be able to walk in there, and whether you are a clergyman or an important politician or a mother or have some sort of famous name, it shouldn't matter because you need help because you're an alcoholic. And so therefore we come together anonymously, share our stories and support one another, right? That's the basic idea of AA. And so she ought to have had a place where she could face the worst things about life without fear of public recrimination, without fear that those things were going to leak out to someone else. So this really is a sad thing that she trusted herself to a group of fellow alcoholics and someone still sold her out for a story. She spoke of hitting her limit, and at one point she had exploded during a Kennedy family gathering. Listen to this. "I ran through every one of the damn Kennedys like a machine gun. I had just had enough. I'd had it up to here. I blasted them all to their face. I let them know exactly how I feel about them." That was the only time you could hear a pin drop in a room full of Kennedys. It was something I'd wanted to do for a long time, but I hadn't had the courage, and I decided I wasn't going to be a mouse anymore. Can you guys picture that at Hyannis or perhaps Hickory Hill? The whole family is sitting around, and Joan, beautiful Joan, stands up in the room. Ted probably mortified because it seems like he was always mortified by her, and her just letting them have it. I'm not generally an advocate for running off with the worst of our feelings. I think oftentimes when I've done that in my life, I've ended up needing to apologize and set right some relationships. And so I don't think it's always the best thing, but it is a funny scene to picture. Ever self-protective, the Kennedys backed Joan. They called that report that gained national traction unadulterated gossip. But the chasm caused by that report was permanent. Maureen Callahan notes, perhaps Joan wanted it that way. By the fall of 1977, Joan had quietly left Ted and moved into her own place, a gorgeous condominium in Boston's Back Bay. Publicly, they were still a married couple, but Joan was breaking away. She was immersing herself in movies and books that depicted the modern woman's struggle. She began attending AA meetings and found the candor and solidarity there to be more therapeutic than any of the fancy rehabs that she had been to. I just noted on this, she, like we all do, needed the ability to walk in the light and tell the full truth about her life. To me, that's what's happening here in this whole scene of you've got AA, you've got her going to therapy, you've got her telling the truth to the Kennedys rapid fire, you've even got her moving out of Ted and moving out of a home with Ted and almost refusing to participate in the lie that their marriage was just the way it had always been. I feel like all of her actions right now are actually aligning with what's true. The truth is we're basically not married. The truth is I'm an alcoholic and I'm going to talk about it. The truth is you people are awful and I'm going to tell you about it. It's like she is just deciding I'm going to walk in the light and I'm going to tell the truth. And that's very freeing. Jackie also was in psychoanalysis, and she had gotten a job as a book editor in New York. If the most famous woman in the world could earn her own money, well then, she thought, why couldn't Joan? She went back to school to get her master's in education, although she doubted she would ever teach. She felt like it gave her credibility and it gave her something to do with her mind. When she was interviewed by People magazine in 1980 for a cover story, kind of setting up Ted's path to the 1980 White House run, she told them, "I couldn't believe how hard it was to stop drinking. Alcoholism is a baffler. I was a periodic drinker, not a daily one. But God knows towards the end of my drinking, talk about being enslaved." I think it's really great that she compares it to enslavement. I think that having dealt with things in our extended family and even in myself, I see the way that anything that we become controlled by is like an enslavement. And it's like we've given power over to another person, another entity, another feeling. It's like we've given over our power to something outside of ourselves. So I love that she used the word enslavement here. Her sobriety had set her free in many ways. It had given her a sense of who she was, what she wanted, and how to stand up for herself. "It was hard for Ted at first," she said, "because I used to say, 'Yes, dear,' to everything, but now I can say no." That was 1980. We're rewinding to 1979. The 10th anniversary of Mary Jo's death was approaching. As with every re-election cycle, his staff encouraged him to call Mary Jo's parents and feel them out. As ever, when he did make the call, he did not take responsibility or offer Gwen and Joe Kopechne any of the things he kept promising to share. He just apologized that this thing was going to generate renewed headlines. This thing being the anniversary of their daughter's death. And for that, Ted was sorry. The Kopechnes, who had heard so much of this before, let him speak and got off the phone. Ted took that to mean they would keep quiet. "Thank God that's over with," Ted said. Going forward, he and his staff would call Chappaquiddick a manageable problem. But Joan, however, was not a manageable problem, but he needed her. He needed her just like Jack had needed Jackie. Domesticity was the picture that Ted needed to sell. But he wasn't moving with the times. American women were questioning sexual mores and politics, rejecting the idea that men inherently knew better, wondering why they could get fired for getting pregnant. The American woman was changing. Ted didn't spend enough time with Joan to realize that she was changing too. So when Joan sat for yet another profile, this one for the Woman's Monthly magazine, McCall's, Joan was on the cover in a white dress, and Ted was at her side, holding her arm as if to keep her in line. This new Joan, the one Ted had spent no time getting acquainted with, went rogue. She validated the whispers about Ted's womanizing. "The rumors and stories," Joan said, "hurt my feelings. Of course they hurt my feelings. They went to the core of my self-esteem. When one grows up feeling that one is sort of special and hoping that one's husband thinks so too, and then suddenly thinking, well, maybe he doesn't. I didn't lose my self-esteem altogether, but it was difficult to hear all the rumors. And I began thinking, well, maybe I'm just not attractive enough, or maybe I'm not attractive anymore at all. And so rather than get mad or ask questions concerning the rumors about Ted and his girlfriends, or really stand up for myself at all, it was easier for me to just go and have a few drinks and calm myself down, as if I weren't hurt or angry." Can y'all almost hear the alarms blaring? Joan had gone off script. This wasn't what Kennedy women do. Her husband's advisors and even his sister Eunice had given Joan in-depth media training. They had told her how to answer every question. She was supposed to dismiss all the stories about Ted as gossip and lies and give their boilerplate answers. She was supposed to pretend theirs was a happy marriage, pretend that she was happy. When one reporter asked her point blank if her husband still loved her, she answered honestly, "I don't know," she said. "I really don't know." This is a Joan who is no longer pretending. It's so brave of her to offer these just forthright answers. You can see the work that she's done in private with psychiatrists and with her AA group has given her this like courageous capacity to tell the truth. It's fantastic. Even still, when Ted decided to run for president, Joan not only supported him, but she agreed to campaign for him, despite her fears for his safety. She was seeing herself as an asset for the campaign. But alongside this, there are more women in the press pool, and there's a winnowing of Kennedy worship. Ted's run at this time made people look more closely at him, more critically, and the public did not like what it was seeing. There was an hour-long primetime interview with CBS News. Joan was not with him, and Ted was under the spotlight. He was unable to give a coherent answer for what had happened at Chappaquiddick or why he wanted to be president. His drinking never came up, but he made sure to bring up Joan's struggles with alcohol. He does sound like someone who's proud of her. Listen to this. Joan's involvement in a continuing program to deal with the problems of her alcoholism, she's going magnificently well, and I'm immensely proud of the fact that she's faced up to it and made the progress that she's made. I just want to say there's some level of recovery language here in his answer, that she's in a program, that she's dealing with her problems, that he says she's going magnificently well. On some level, that could just be a Kennedy, painting a good cover on the story. But he says, I'm immensely proud of the fact that she's faced up to it. So that's good. I think that's good. It's possible he's just blowing smoke, but I think there is at least some level probably of like cheering her on in this, even if it is only public. It makes it sound like they didn't have much of this mutual encouragement happening in their actual relationship. Listen to this. In 1972, National Lampoon had ran a parody of a Volkswagen ad written by a humorist with the car floating upright in the pond. So you can just picture the little beetle there in the pond. And it said, if Ted Kennedy drove a Volkswagen, he'd be president today. I thought that was really funny. In a 1979 Saturday Night Live skit, a brutal sketch of Bill Murray was put on where he was acting as Ted. He was soaked with seaweed hanging off his shoulders. He arrived late and breathless to a campaign stop. I think that Joan might still be in the car. I actually love this. I think this is the perfect use of political satire, to not see our politicians as royalty or as untouchable or as if they always have superior motives, but to actually view them as human beings. We do have road noise. I had a viewer recommend, well, maybe you need to go film in a closet. And I'm just not going to do that right now. I like my little backdrop. I like the old maps and my plant and the bright lights here. If I go to our one closet that we have in the house, it would just be backpacking gear and little boys' clothing bins as my backdrop. And that does not seem near as lovely. If you guys all hate the car noise that occasionally comes by, then you can let me know. But my plan currently is just to go right on reading right here with you guys. Back to the book. Women were no longer buying Ted's excuses. They were no longer willing to look the other way as voters to minimize what was openly known as Ted's relentless womanizing. They were no longer going to allow his problems to be blamed on Joan. Right before I read this, we had just read as a family through Proverbs 1. And there is a verse in Proverbs 1 that's describing the wicked, and it says, they shall eat the fruit of their way. And that just came right back into my head as I was reading this, that we've seen Ted all along. He's been stupid in so many instances. He's been womanizing. He didn't even honor Joan enough to buy her a ring. He seems like he's trying to get out of their wedding. He hurries away from their honeymoon. He's constantly womanizing. He makes this terrible set of decisions around Chappaquiddick that completely humiliates her. He mocks her alcoholism. I mean, he's just been a beast of a man. And yet, we haven't fully seen him pay for it. But we start to see him pay for it here. He's starting to have to eat the fruit of the way that he's chosen. When we were talking with our kids about that verse, we were just talking about how the choices of your life keep watering and watering and watering the seeds and trees that you are planting and helping to flourish. And so whatever you're doing with your life is growing up as the way of your life. But eventually you got to eat the fruit of whatever way that you have watered and cultivated and nourished. So Ted is having to do that. He's finally having to eat some of the fruit of his decisions here. A 6-page piece runs in the Washington Monthly. The editor-in-chief said he thought that this piece had important and wise things to say about women and their relationship to Ted Kennedy. The headline was, Kennedy's Woman Problem, Women's Kennedy Problem. The piece argued that female voters had been hoodwinked by the boys in the press who kept Ted's philandering a secret. Despite the male-led idea that talking about such things was sleazy or betrayed a lesser mind, and that, of course, women, their small world defined by domestic concerns, would be more preoccupied than want to know about a male politician's sex life, Lessard argued that Ted's chronic cheating was legitimate cause for concern. It suggests an old-fashioned, male chauvinist, exploitative view of women as primarily objects of pleasure. It gives me the creeps, the constant pursuit, although the image is almost passive in a way, of semi-covert, just barely personal and ultimately discardable encounters is a creepy way to act. What it suggests, Lessard wrote, is a severe case of arrested development, a kind of narcissistic intemperance, a huge babyish ego that must constantly be fed. It suggests if he is immature in this area, mightn't he be in others? It bothers me because I associate this type of behavior with misogyny. I don't believe men who really like women carry on in this way. Finally, we get someone who has told the truth. Susanna Lessard finally has written it, and even though it was picked up and then dropped by one publication, the Washington Monthly publishes this 6-page expose that finally deals with Ted Kennedy's womanizing and tells the truth about it. It's clear insight. Jackie wrote Joan a letter essentially saying, who could put up with this kind of treatment? You can't have a man constantly womanizing in your face and actually still be caring for him and campaigning for him. Maureen Callahan says Jackie could have been talking to a younger version of herself. This was the Jackie who would tell her grown children that if Jack had somehow returned to her now, she very well might turn him away. But Joan decided she could not leave Ted while he was running for president. The Kennedys wouldn't allow it. And besides, Jackie didn't understand the rousing effect that Joan got from campaigning. People were coming to see her. They wanted to talk to her, and more incredibly, they wanted to hear what she had to say. Joan's sobriety had given her a gift, the ability to embrace her rage. Instead of dulling it with alcohol, she was feeling it now, and it felt good, justified, and appropriate. America was getting a second look at Joan Kennedy, and they were rooting for her. The unspoken consensus was that marriage to Ted Kennedy was a burden no woman should have to endure. Various headlines read, Joan's journey, back on board with steady eyes and new strength. Another one, the vulnerable side of Jonesy. Another, Joan strides out of her dark age. The New York Times ran a glowing piece on her advocacy. She was fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment and saying things that at the time were still controversial, that all women should have access to higher education, to employment, and to the same pay as men, that motherhood was devalued in American society, and too often women were left financially dependent on their husbands. On the surface, Joan appeared to be campaigning for her husband, but whom was she fighting for really? She said at this time, I know that if Ted is elected president of the United States, I will commit myself to the ongoing struggle for women's equality with everything I have and everything I am. This was the outgrowth of the inner work she had done on herself. She was willing to fight for women, and she had the voice to do it. Well, she could have stayed, even after he dropped out of the race on August 11th, 1980. Ted, for the sake of his career, would have done anything to keep the magic intact, was what I was going to read. Ted, for the sake of his career, would have done anything to keep the marriage intact. It never had any magic. But Joan, it turned out, had been campaigning for herself all along. When I looked at the endnotes, I don't know if I'm just misreading it, it seemed to indicate that once Ted withdrew from the race, it says he had no interest in reconciling, and she realized he had only ever been using her. So that's a little bit of a discrepancy from what's written here that I just noticed, because I think it's helpful to see the progress. He did not actually want to be reconciled, and it turns out they filed for divorce in 1981, which was 23 years after they had married. So that's the end of what we read about Joan Kennedy in this book. And our next chapter is going to be Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. We will get our follow-up from chapter 1. Before we leave, I want to pose you guys a few questions for conversation. One would be just discussing the realities of addiction. It is difficult to navigate addiction certainly in marriage. Someone I'm close to had to deal with that for quite some time, and it does produce these toxic effects in each partner in the marriage the longer that it goes on. And so I want to honor that even while sometimes we're boldly vilifying Ted, and often deservedly, that it is difficult to be in a marriage with an alcoholic, and it does produce reactionary behaviors that are complex. And so I just want to honor that he is also not a one-sided figure who only ever was the villain. And I want to point people, if you or someone you know is dealing with that, there is a whole set of groups now. There's AA, NA, there's a group called ITAA, Internet and Technology Addicts Anonymous. There are a lot of groups that specifically deal with addiction. And so if you or someone you love is dealing with that, 12-step groups can be a great way to deal with that. And there are also like grief processing groups, and there are recovery groups. There are a lot of community groups at churches, but also just there are online Zoom opportunities. So I just want to share that and kind of put that out there, that if you or someone you love is dealing with that there are options for discrete opportunities to meet with others and grow through hard things. There also is a group called Al-Anon, I believe, that's for people who are loved ones of alcoholics. So if you're in a position like maybe you were raised by an alcoholic mother, there might be groups like that can even help you with your like secondary behavior traits that are often common to people who have been raised by or married to an addict. So with that said, I just wanted to make that clear because I think it's important. It was part of Joan's story. I have benefited from 12-step groups myself, and I find that process really helpful and healing. And so if that's something that you might be interested in, it might be worth taking a look. Also, I just want to praise Joan's willingness to tell the truth. I think that's a really brave and hard thing, especially once you're already in a circumstance that's undesirable. If you're, 19 and you're just starting out in the world, then you can operate in a way that's potentially telling the truth about everything and where you're living in line with your values. But when, as she did, you wake up and you realize this marriage isn't what I pictured, he's not the father I was expecting, he's not the husband I was hoping for, and now he's even damaged his political choices, his political opportunities, to where the dreams and hopes that we may have had aren't even going to come out. The fact that she's willing to tell the truth in the middle of all of that is really quite something. And telling the truth about our circumstances is hard, but I think it's a really important part of like being sane, and also just part of being yourself in the world, is bringing the truth about how things operate from your vantage point and what you're seeing. Sometimes that's the best gift you have to give to the world, is to be able to and willing to tell the truth to people that you love if they're willing to receive it. And the fact that she was willing to do that is quite bold. Yeah, so please join me for this episode. I think it's going to be fun. Like I said last time, the episode that we got, the chapter that we got on Rose Kennedy, for me was cut really short, and I felt disillusioned by how little information we were given. And so maybe this article will give us a little bit more of a wrap up of Rose Kennedy's life to some degree, and maybe we'll even get a peek at Ted and Joan. And then soon I am going to be starting this. I think I'm going to run the chapters of this simultaneous to some of the last few episodes so that we get a little bit into this before we finish with Ask Not. So be on the lookout for that. Be ready to join me for that. I'm really getting excited about diving a little deeper into Chappaquiddick and understanding more of the details of this. I've been watching some documentaries and just learning more about even alternative theories of what happened. And so I'm really fascinated to dig into this and see how he deals with the facts and really does an expose. This should be really good, of the Chappaquiddick incident. So I hope you'll join me for that. Really appreciate you guys. I hope I've earned your subscription and your like today. If so, would you please hit that like button and go ahead and make sure you're subscribed. I love these things, and I hope you'll continue to join me. Y'all have a great day. Bye.